Thanks, Uma. So everyone's able to hear me? Yeah? Okay. Okay, so, as Uma said, I'm basically a behavioral and evolutionary ecologist. And what really fascinates me is trying to understand why we see diversity in traits, mostly behavioral and life history traits, why we see this diversity and what's the role both of ecological processes and evolutionary processes in producing, in kind of maintaining this diversity. And along the way, I've also been really interested in seeing whether we can apply some of these behavioral and evolutionary ecological principles towards, trying to contribute towards some applied questions. Say, for example, initially when studying a wildlife species like blackbuck antelope, which live in these very human-dominated landscapes, can we try and apply principles about foraging ecology, how they manage risk and reward, to understand how they would move in a human-dominated landscape? Would they be able to persist there, or would they go extinct? Can we predict where they might cause a lot of crop damage based on foraging behavior principles? Which fields are likely to get affected more than others, and so on. So basically, after understanding the behavioral ecology of something like foraging behavior, how do we use it for an applied problem like managing human-wildlife conflict? Similarly, in recent years, my students and I have been looking at mosquitoes, initially because they're just such amazing, fascinating creatures whom you can really study to understand how life history evolution or how behavioral diversity, they just show these amazing oviposition strategies. How has ecology and evolution shaped these strategies? But then recently we've started to also look at, can we use this information to try to also understand phenomena that might be important from an applied perspective. So understanding vector dynamics, implications for disease transmission potential of these vectors, and so on. So today I'm hoping this will be much more of a discussion than a lecture really. So what I'm hoping we can do, the aim for today, for this session, is to discuss with you what the links are between climate change and vector populations and behavior, keeping in mind that we are interested in this from the point of view of thinking about predictions, implications for disease spread, for disease transmission potential of the vectors, and the outcome being patterns in disease in the landscape, space and time. So that's the plan. And as I hope I'm able to convey to you through the discussion, by the end of this discussion, this is a fast, growing research field. It's very controversial in the sense, if you were to look at the most recent, in the past 4-5 years, papers on climate change and disease, the patterns and the spread of vector-borne diseases, you'll find that there are some who believe there are going to be strong climate change signals and others who believe none of it matters. And what I hope we can do through this discussion is figure out why this controversy and what are the gaps in what we know and what do people think are the ways forward. What are key bits of research that needs to be done now to understand, to be able to predict disease spread of vector-borne diseases under this climate change scenarios. Okay, so a few things we should make sure we all are on the same page on. So can you see me if I write? Can you see if I write here? Okay, yeah, okay. Okay, so first, what do we all understand by what a vector is, disease vector? So yesterday when I was putting this together in my 11-year-old daughter came by and said, "Oh, vector, you're doing math." So I realized then we should first maybe, talk about, yeah. So what do you understand by a vector in your mind? Anybody? Do you want to just put your hand up so that I can see you wherever you are?
Vector is an organism which has been adapted very well with the pathogen without showing its symptoms of its presence. It transmits from its origin to the next neighboring host.
Yeah, great. Would everybody agree with that? That basically a vector is an organism that carries or transmits an infectious pathogen from one individual to another. Is that okay for everybody? Okay, great. So there'll be two systems that I'll keep referring to. So I thought we could just quickly go over them because they are two very interesting vector, host, pathogen systems. The first is this is kind of a generalized mosquito type system. So what we have here is there's something that I can use to pointer. Okay, thank you so much. Yes, perfect. Okay, so what you can see here, so all of you know that mosquitoes have complex metamorphosis, right? So what you can see here is this adult female, she lays eggs. In some species, if she is already infected, the eggs can be infected, right? And then you have multiple larval stages, all in the water, pupal stage, again in the water, adults emerge, an uninfected female bites an infected host, and this could be, any non-human, depending on the mosquito system, it could be a non-human host or a human host, and then when it bites another uninfected host individual, it can transmit the pathogen. Right? So mosquito, is everyone fairly aware of the mosquito system? Can people give me examples of a disease that is transmitted by mosquitoes in humans, let's say? Actually, it doesn't matter. It could be wildlife also. Sorry? Dengue, yes.
Chikungunya, someone said.
Chikungunya, dengue, malaria, Zika, filariasis. Okay, actually, if I start writing, there'll be lots of it here. So I'll just write some of it here. Right, and in fact, these are some of malaria is probably the most medically most important vector-borne disease. So I should just mention that when we think about vector-borne diseases, usually we are thinking about those with arthropods as the vectors. One important set are mosquitoes, other dipterans like sandflies and so on. Another really important set has to do with ticks. So mosquitoes have relatively short generation lengths, and that will turn out to be important when we start discussing climate change and impacts on vectors. Ticks, on the other hand, have much longer life cycles. So here's a very generalized life cycle of the dynamics between the tick and the vector and the host. So here, say you have a female lays eggs which could either be uninfected or infected depending on conditions. The eggs, the larvae that come out typically are uninfected, most of the time. So they might either feed on hosts, usually small mammals that are uninfected, or if they do happen to feed on a host that is infected, the nymphs can be infected. So now when they develop and either feed on larger mammals like deer or on humans, the infection can get passed on. So with ticks, you can have these different bacterial infections like for Lyme disease that get transmitted. So here the interesting thing is humans are incidental in the sense that the pathogen is not multiplying, amplifying very strongly in humans and then having, human to human transmission and so on, unlike the case of mosquitoes. So another big difference when we talk later on about how climate change can impact vectors has to do with having all these systems where you have multiple non-human hosts versus systems where largely the main hosts are humans. So human to human transmission. So we'll talk about that a bit later. Okay, so everyone's fine with mosquito and tick systems, right? Okay. So now I want you to take 1 minute and give me your initial, like your intuition about how climate change, forget about the disease for now, how do you think climate change is going to affect vector populations? Okay, and before that, again, let's all be similarly clear about what we mean by climate change. What are the main predictions about what the climate what will climate change result in? When we think about climate change, what do we think is going to happen? Anybody? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Increasing temperature.
Okay, yeah, broadly increasing temperatures and especially in the northern hemisphere. Yeah.
Poor rainfall, desert.
Precipitation effects, okay.
Change in seasonality.
Seasonality of temperature or?
Of weather and basically
What aspect of
monsoons coming late or like
so variability.
Variability.
Yeah, okay. So there is increasing temperatures and this is thought, most climate models show this to be particularly important in the northern hemisphere. Increasing rainfall patterns in some places, more in the northern hemisphere, like northern Asia, Europe and so on, but less in Central to Southern America where it can get drier. So there are some places where it's going to get wetter, some places drier. Also variability, as people pointed out. So for example, here is one cartoon of just thinking about temperature and this shift both in mean and in variance. So what you had all mentioned, that the average, it's going to get hotter, but because the variance is increasing, what we also expect is these extreme, say, hot events, right? And apart from this, we also expect extreme weather events like droughts, floods, and so on, right? So think about mean, variance in temperature, precipitation, and extreme weather events. So keeping this in mind, take 1 minute and I'm just going to ask you for your just initial intuitions about what you think is the broad effect of what you think is going to be the broad effect of such climate change on vectors, okay?
What's going to happen to vectors?
Huh.
So range of geographical range of these vectors is going to expand. Like if it is going, like if the temperature is going to increase, so I feel.
Great, okay. So let me put that down. Geographic range, extension. Somebody else had their, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so extreme weather events are going to displace humans. They're going to increase human density, and then breeding grounds for vectors are going to increase in urban spaces as well.
Yeah, so you're thinking of So this is maybe more of a temperature creating direct conditions that are conducive for the population growth of the vector. You're thinking, say, more about host populations or host behavior that will then, what you're saying will increase suitability, habitat suitability for vectors. Okay. Anybody else from over here? Any thoughts? Would you agree? Do you think things might get different? Yeah, go ahead.
Rains can also shift, I think, and also there could be changes in phenology in the factors. I'm not sure.
So which way will it, what do you feel? Do you think it will result in increases in vector populations or decreases?
I think it will depend on the climate change effect, but it can also like change in their breeding pattern. They can
Okay, so change in breeding patterns of the vectors. Okay.
No, I'm saying.
Okay. So,
Yeah?
like for mosquito completing life cycles, they need water. So, if maybe hot weather will be there, then less water will be there. So, their habitat may be shift to somewhere else and all this.
Okay, so like in the previous case, the point is the shift could either be, shift can even be negative. So you can also have vector populations go down, right? Okay, so any other points? Yeah.
Change in community structure of the vector.
Change in community. Can you explain a little bit?
Like if there are multiple mosquito species, due to increase in temperature, one may take over the other in the particular geographic area.
Yes.
And that could cause a difference in pathogens also.
Yes, yes. So you could have community composition changes with, say, one vector increasing and another vector decreasing, which can of course have disease transmission implications.
So yeah, great. People are talking about communities. Hoo-hoo.
Shorter life cycle. So
shorter life cycles of the vector. Why shorter life cycle? Can you explain?
Yeah, so they may need high temperature to develop fast. So if that happens, they'll have shorter life cycle and then their generation time also will decrease. So more generations in that time period, in a certain time period, more of mosquitoes.
So shorter life cycle, many more generations, and that would mean what? Larger population or?
Larger population if they don't die fast.
Okay, if they don't die fast, right. Then there would be larger population. Okay, great. So, as you can see here, there are you've all, one more.
Does really changes the life cycle of a vector when...
Sorry, I can't hear.
Does really changes that vector life cycle?
Rain.
No, yeah, that range of the life cycle. Really,
Does
it really changes?
Yes. Do you mean the generation length?
Does the life cycle of a particular pathogen changes or the vector changes?
We're talking about the vector here. All this is about vector populations. So it's range extension of the vector, of the mosquito or the tick or the sandfly or whichever one. And similarly, what we are talking about right now is shorter life cycles of the vector. You might also get more rapid pathogen growth, but we're not talking about that now.
So does it affect, this shorter lifespan, does it apply to all the vectors or any particular vectors?
That's what we'll come to the evidence a bit later. Because the evidence, as you'll see, is actually all over the place. So we'll talk about that. These are right now ideas about what can increase temperature. We just talked about climate change effects, right? Potential climate change effects. What can increase temperature or rainfall or variable For example, greater variation in diurnal temperature or greater variability in precipitation. These are our current intuitions about how they might affect vector populations. One possibility is if the kind of conducive environment, like higher temperatures are better for larval development, pupal development, you could just have the generation length becoming shorter because they are now moving from stage to stage faster. That's the idea. Does that answer your question? You want to know whether that's true. We'll come to that, right? That's your question. We'll come to that, but this is the idea, the kind of hypothesis right now. Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Great. But as we go through some of the evidence, you'll see that it all gets much more complex than we expect. So for that, to understand why it can get complex, let's try and organize this information better. Okay, so suppose I just showed you, a map of an area, okay, and I have just kind of gridded it up, okay, and I told you that, here you have an area of very high density of some mosquito-borne disease, whatever you like, take your pick. Here it's lower, here it's very rare, again, really high, even higher and so on. So suppose you have variation in this landscape. Some of the ideas you've given, I can already use to try and understand why, right? Why is it really high in some places than others? One idea would be, it has to do with vector populations, right? That you have lots more adult females there biting away happily and moving from host to host. That's why you have greater cases there. Would you agree with that? Yeah? Okay. Now, what can affect vector populations? Some ideas that you've come up with, that you've told me now, is that it could be abiotic factors, right? So, better, more conducive temperature, and then humidity. If it's a mosquito, we are thinking of water, larval habitats, right? Whether there are these water pools present. What about biotic factors? Can you think? Sorry? Yeah. Okay, so predators, either of the adults or the larvae. Okay, somebody else said something here. Host. We'll come to the host a bit, but absolutely, you are right. So you also have like host population densities. Maybe there are just more people there, right? That's what you mean. Any other?
For breeding, they need a host, I think.
The adult female has to get a blood meal to produce eggs. Absolutely. Competition. Yes. Competition, you mean within, among mosquitoes, mosquito larvae, or? Yeah, so competition could be intraspecific or interspecific. Maybe, like somebody else had mentioned also, maybe you can have different mosquito species affecting each other's populations, right? So we have predators, we have competition. You could also have other things like disease, etc. And now the thing to think about is, these are all going to have different effects on the vector populations, right? Suppose you think of this as vector. Let's think of important characteristics of the population. Suppose we think of density, predators might actually decrease density, right? So we are thinking something like temperature will, I think the idea was, will increase density. Similarly, precipitation, increased larval habitats will increase density, right? Predators will decrease density. What about competition? Will also decrease density. Now, let's move from thinking about just density, because what do you think? Greater density, do you think if we think about something like disease transmission potential, how successfully, if you think of disease transmission potential, that is, how successfully will an adult female bite an infected host, get infected, find an uninfected host, bite and transmit, right? You need all those steps. Now, with increased density, what do you think? Will disease transmission go up or go down? Most people say up. Why? Because the vector has to carry pathogen from something. Let's assume there are infected hosts around. Yeah, absolutely. So you need a kind of vector host ratio also, which will affect. So it's not, initially we might just think higher density means greater disease transmission potential, but it can depend on host factors to do with the host, like vector host ratios, absolutely. Anything else? Anybody else feel it might not be so simple, that maybe increased density can get reduced transmission? Can you think of any reason why that might happen?
This vector's sex ratio.
Why will
if
that?
If more males are there, they are not blood feeder. So then transmission will go down and the population
if
also
density goes up, but only among males. Is that what you're saying? Because I'm saying if density goes up, you're saying that if all that density increases only among males. Suppose both male and female density go up.
No, I am talking the sex ratio of male and female.
Correct.
If less females are there, more males are there.
But why should that affect at higher density? Suppose you have higher female densities, even if their ratio is less compared to males, why will that result in less transmission potential?
I can think of one thing. Let's say there are 100 people and only 3 or 4 are infected. The probability of the mosquito finding the infected host will decrease as the number of uninfected hosts increase. So that is where probably it might negatively affect the disease transmission.
Why would higher density? So you've already said vector host.
Yeah.
But why will more mosquitoes with this vector host ratio result in less disease transmission?
Okay, you're speaking with respect to the
density.
Mosquitoes. Okay.
Yes, yes. So density, this is all vector population density. You had some point? No, they don't bite for blood meal. Yeah. Yeah, but yes, the sex ratio matters. But if female density is anyway increasing, you have to then explain why sex ratio, even when female density is higher, will reduce disease transmission potential.
Away from the vectors, right? Just a thing.
Who will move away? So this is vector density, vector population density. As vector population density increases, then?
Means, I was thinking.
Are you thinking of host movement?
Yeah.
Human? No, that's absolutely possible.
Yeah.
So
I was thinking of the host movement. The host will move away from that vectors.
There are lots of things about what hosts do which will complicate this relationship. Absolutely. That is correct. Absolutely. Any other ideas? Host control measures can again affect through reducing density is what you're thinking. So although all this increases density, something about human behavior will reduce density and therefore affect disease transmission potential. Okay, but I want to use this opportunity to say, even if none of this matters, just looking at vector numbers turns out to be not sufficient if we want to think of disease transmission potential, and that's because things like density and so on affect, I think Farah had talked to you about traits and disease, right? Vector traits can also affect their disease transmission potential. And I'll just mention a few important traits. A key one is body size. How would you generally expect density to affect body size? If resources are limiting, higher density would mean smaller body size, right? Yeah? Okay. So just quickly to show you, this is some work that a former student from the lab did. She is now a faculty member at Ashoka University. So what Manvi did is she really wanted to understand how competition and predation affect AD's different functional traits. And the traits that she looked at are body size and survival and development time. So let me first tell you what she found, and then I'll try to link it to traits that are important for disease transmission. Okay, so what she did was she set up in the lab different combinations of competitor densities, and this is just intraspecific competition. So just conspecific densities and predators and combinations of this. So you had low to high competition, intraspecific competition, crossed with low to high predator density. So first, what I want you to do is just focus on this section of this graph. What this shows you is under conspecific density, what are the chances of surviving to pupation? Okay, so what is the chance of surviving to pupation as you go from low density, so 40 larvae per container. So this is Aedes aegypti, which is a container breeding mosquito, and it can, it's kind of domesticated and urbanized species. So you find it both in like tree holes and so on, but you'll also find it in any tiny container, okay? So what you can see is as the number of conspecifics, other larvae per container increases, survival drops dramatically, right? So the next thing I want you to do is focus across this gradient. So what do you have here? No predators. So this is purely competition working here. Here you have one predator per container. These are dragonfly nymphs. Two predators per container, and you find these dragonfly nymphs these occurring together, especially say small tanks in nurseries, in more kind of greener in rural areas and so on. This is 2 dragonfly nymphs per container. This is 4. What you will also notice is if you go across this predation gradient, what do you see? Survival drops, right? Dramatically as you go across. So both competition and predation, as you might expect, right? We talked about this, do affect survival, which will affect density, right? So this is as you have all pointed out. Now comes the tricky part. This tells you how competition and predation affect development time. Let's just focus on females for now, okay? Let's ignore this male part. Let's just focus on females. As you go across, just first now pay attention to competition. As you go across this density gradient, what do you see? Development time increases, right? Which means longer generation lengths, which means the vector population is growing more slowly, right? But notice this. You can see these different colors here. They represent a gradient in predator density. So what are predators doing? Just focus, say, on this one here. High conspecific density, what are predators doing? If you just look at these two, just these two sets of points, what are predators doing? They're actually rescuing from competition. So they are reducing densities, right? And because of that, the surviving, they are acting like one filter. The surviving mosquitoes, either because their quality is better or because they have access to better resources, they are developing faster. The same thing happens with body size. So wing length is often used as an index of body size, because if you use something like body mass, the problem is it can fluctuate a lot. If a female has had a blood meal, or she's just fed on some sugar solution, some nectar, something, the body mass can go up and down. So wing size is often quite a good estimate of. You had a question? Yeah, tell.
The direction of selection due to predation and the direction of selection due to competition, they might not be in the same direction, right?
Yes.
Like an allele being selected for, let's say, faster development, and an allele that is being eaten by a predator. I mean, they might not be opposite, right?
So it can go in many different ways. So for example, sometimes, so part of this developing faster might have to do with that consumptive effect, meaning predators are eating up individuals. So the ones who survive either have access or are better able to use, meaning there can be a genetic component in there. They are better able to use resources, they develop faster. But you can also have selection to develop faster to get out of that risky environment. So you can actually get out faster because you want to move out from that risky environment. With competition, the kinds of traits that would be selected are traits that help individuals acquire resources faster. Now, in this kind of a system, there isn't direct like contest competition. Say the way, two individuals that are territorial may fight for a resource. This is what is called mostly scramble competition, in the sense if I eat this, it's not available for you. So whoever is better at finding and consuming resources, that trait will be selected for under competition. So yeah, so sometimes certain traits you can have both, acting together, and sometimes they can actually oppose also. So it can get quite complex. In this case, the development doesn't seem to be because of trying to escape the environment, at least in large part it's not, because they are actually emerging larger. So in cases where you have individuals just, if you keep the resources constant and you have them emerging faster, you will find them emerging smaller. But in this case, actually, they are emerging larger. So if you look here at competition, what you can see is that overall, the mosquitoes that are emerging, the adults are smaller, right? So what is competition doing? Competition is increasing development rate, which means longer now generation lengths, but decreasing and decreasing body size. So they are emerging slower, but they're coming out smaller also.
Ma'am,
Yeah?
the development rate, that's for the survivors, right?
Yes.
At that time, that's just for the survivors.
Absolutely, yeah. This is whoever managed to make it to the pupal
The
stage.
increase in body size also result in the more requirement of blood meal?
So that's what we'll come to. So what I wanted to make clear by the end of this discussion is that competition can reduce survival. It can also make for smaller mosquitoes and longer generation lengths. Predation, it all depends. If there are lots of others around, they'll still survive, come out larger. If there are not many others around, everyone dies. So it really depends. So the point here, the next point is what was just brought up now, which is why does this matter? Why does it matter? It might be exciting, say, because I'm interested in life history, evolution, and trade-offs. But if you're a disease ecologist, should you care? Yes, because there's a more and more information that body size can affect traits that are important for this disease transmission potential. So for example, body size can affect how many eggs are produced, and this can have two kinds of effects ultimately on disease transmission. One is more eggs, it starts affecting vector population dynamics. In species like Aedes, where there is vertical transmission, which we'd seen, meaning that you can have eggs being infected with the dengue virus, for example, it's increasing the chances of infection in the environment, right? So body size can also affect flight ability. Depending on the mosquito species, smaller individuals may either fly less or in a few rare cases fly more. So again, imagine the disease transmission process, right? Find a host, bite, move, find uninfected, bite again. How you move will affect that pattern of spread. Is it going to be much more localized? Is it going to be greater? And although we don't know again much of that with mosquitoes, these are not vectors. This is not a vector system, but a lot of work on Arctic foxes and in the context of rabies, badgers in the context of bovine tuberculosis in the UK has shown that dispersal can strongly affect how these diseases spread in an environment, and very counterintuitively sometimes. So for example, culling of badgers resulted in a local increase in tuberculosis transmission, but that's because individuals were moving more now. So you had reduced density, greater movement, and a counterintuitive effect on the disease. So movement and anything that affects movement, again, can affect this. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Movement can also affect where individuals lay their eggs. So again, vector population and disease transmission. Body size can also affect longevity. And remember, in most of these vectors, they can keep infecting uninfected hosts throughout their lifespan. So greater longevity would mean increased transmission risk. Lower longevity would mean less. And the interesting thing is, again, even here, initially research showed that bigger body size means greater longevity because you have more resources, you can live for longer. But it's turning out, at least in some of these mosquito, like in Anopheles, the malaria vector, it's turning out to be complicated. It's your body size plus what stressors were there as you were growing up. So either it can increase longevity, or sometimes a larger individual actually are more prone to adult stressors and die. So even this body size longevity relationship turns out to be tricky. Okay, so let me just kind of sum up what we've discussed now. We've not even got to climate change, right? Right now, what we are trying to understand is to build a framework of how characteristics about the vector, right? All these characteristics about the vector. What are the factors that affect these characteristics? Why do we care? That is, how does it affect disease transmission potential of these vectors? What we've not actually even gone into much is, this is not enough, as many of you brought up, host population, host behavior, and the interaction between host and vector also affects disease transmission, right? And finally, I think in the past week you've done a lot with the pathogens. I'm not even going there, but actually you also need to understand pathogen ecology and evolutionary ecology and where that fits in with vector and host population and host to affect disease transmission. Does this framework make sense? Yeah. So there are some great papers that have laid this out quite nicely, at least parts of it. So I thought what I do is, after this I'll just mail it on the list of all participants. So there was recent, in 2024, there was a review in, I think it was in Nature Microbiology, I think, which was really nice, kind of summarizing the state of information. And then there's also a paper by Karthikeyan Chandrasekharan and others and his colleagues who've tried to, again, you'll see similar things here, who've tried to put this framework together. So this is for a mosquito, but you could do the same thing with ticks. So mosquito life cycle, abiotic, biotic factors, how that might affect different body traits and affect behavior like activity, biting, etc. That will then affect disease transmission potential. Okay, so I'll share that paper also with you. Okay, so let's do one thing. It's 9:57. We'll just take a 3-minute break, just so that if anyone is starting to zone out, can wake up a bit. I find I can usually pay attention for 25 minutes. I'm hoping all of you are younger, so you can pay attention for a bit longer than me. But yeah, let's just, because now we'll move on to climate change and vectors. Okay, let's continue. Okay, so what we talked about was trying to understand what features about the whole vector and host, and we didn't talk about the pathogen bit in there at all. What traits involved there would affect disease transmission potential or disease transmission risk, patterns in disease, however you want to think about it. Now, with that framework in mind, let's now try to think of, what would we predict climate change impacts to be. So let's again take these two systems, mosquitoes and ticks. With mosquitoes, a lot of models suggest that an increase in temperature should mean an increase in the vector population, and that's because now you have more suitable environmental conditions, the things we discussed before, faster development, larger populations, etc. However, more recent models have suggested that in fact, if you look at temperature and mosquito performance, either their populations or their, this probability of successfully biting an infected host, getting infected, and then transmitting it to an uninfected host. So if you think of any kind of mosquito, any of those important performance measures, what people are finding is that it's not just, and this is within the range of projected temperature gradients that are going to be out there. What they are suggesting is you're going to have a peak, and if temperatures in certain areas increase beyond that, in fact, you might see a reduction in vector performance. So the question now is to figure out how general is this and which areas are going to fall in different parts of this temperature range. This is also different for different mosquitoes. So for example, some work has suggested that this might look very different. So if this is, say, for Anopheles, the malaria vector, it seems like some studies suggest that the Aedes can actually peak at a slightly higher rate. So what you might find is a process that I think somebody had mentioned, suggested before, which is you might find that one vector is on the decline, but then you have another one coming in, and that the pathogen it transmits might now start increasing in the area. So you can have this community shift also. So temperature and vector populations for mosquitoes depends, right? What about for ticks? For ticks, again, an increase in temperature generally is an increase in the vector population, unless it's also accompanied by dry conditions, because ticks are very prone to desiccation. So if it's higher temperature but with lower precipitation, then the tick population can go down. If it's higher temperature with higher rainfall, tick population can go up. The other interesting thing with ticks is not just the population, or actually with mosquitoes also. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Behavior can also change. So what studies have found is that if you have these hot, dry conditions, it's not as if animals don't try to, don't respond, right, within what is available to them, their kind of evolutionary repertoire. They do respond to these changing conditions. So ticks have now been the larval and nymph stages, because what they do is the larval stage feeds and drops off usually. For most ticks, feed, drop off, next stage feeds, drops off from a host. They spend a lot of time in the soil or under litter. So what that does is that this behavioral change can affect the host vector interactions. Which again changes how the diseases spread among different host populations. So things like temperature and precipitation can affect both numbers, and they can also affect behavior. As I think you mentioned before, they can affect where you find them in the landscape. So you can get these range extensions, but you can also get range contractions, because areas that have now become too hot for that vector, you can actually see a reduction in that vector population, right? And if temperature and precipitation affect those traits we talked about before, like body size, etc., again we know that the answer to whether it will then affect vector populations and disease transmission, based on our discussion till now, is It depends. If body size goes up, something is to be expected. If body size comes down, something else is to be expected. So because a lot of these answers are it depends, there's a lot of discussion in the literature about whether we need to worry about climate change or not. So I'll just summarize the kind of two sides of it. So most of the models make predictions like this. So for example, this is a cartoon of the major predictions. One big pattern that's predicted by many of the models is this expansion towards the poles. Sometimes it's also accompanied by contractions, where it gets too hot. But a broad pattern predicted by many different models is this projected expansion of vector suitability towards poles.
Can I just, sorry. So actually this is really, sorry, I had to step out, maybe I missed something. So I'm misstating, but this is really important because you see a lot of times people saying that, oh, you can just use some global models to predict what should happen. And a lot of meta-analyses are doing that. But given, I guess you would say that for things like vectors specifically, everything is so local, real information is very, very important.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, as I'll mention some of the controversies, that's what people are pointing out, that without understanding vector biology and ecology, it's very difficult to make very kind of useful predictions that say management action can be taken, policy action can be taken based on that, absolutely. Yeah. The other big pattern that models predict is that you should see as, with climate change, what you should see is vectors going up a mountain. So increases in higher altitudes, right? But let me just show you a couple of these models and then talk about where's the evidence for all of this. So here is another model. This is for different ticks. These are all different species of ticks. And again, projections for where you should see increases. So increases are in red and decreases are, range loss is in blue. So as you can see, increase in higher latitudes, decreases in lower latitudes. This is for ticks. Here is an example for a mosquito born. This is projected number of dengue cases in Europe, modeled using conditions from Mexico. So if you just look at one of these, this is the baseline, and just quickly notice that again you're seeing that areas on the coast and towards the south are increasing. The projection is for areas here to increase compared to areas further north. What the authors also did very interestingly is they said, okay, we did this using data from Mexico where it's endemic. Now let's just imagine that dengue is entering a system where there are these huge uninfected populations, big, these, kind of new host populations available. When they do that, now you can see, compare this to this here. Now suddenly the spread is huge because of the host population and host behavior characteristics. The spread could be even more than in areas where you assume that it's been endemic for a while. But again they point out, it might go in the other direction. Why? You don't have much, you have Aedes aegypti, the main dengue vector mosquito, in only a few pockets in Europe still. Most of it is Aedes albopictus. And Aedes albopictus, at least till now, is not yet as effective as aegypti in transmission. It might be getting there. As of now, it's not yet as effective. But it can tolerate those colder winters, which aegypti is apparently, as of now, unable to. right? So, it may evolve, exactly. So that's why we have to keep saying as of now. So which means the whole thing might shift downwards. So even though temperatures are going up and albopictus is, Aedes albopictus, this mosquito is able to move around, but if it's not as good at transmitting, the spread may not be what we think it is. Again, to make the point that it depends on the vector characteristics, and what the authors point out is, say compared to Mexico, in many places people may not, keep windows open, or, you might have very different host behavior, might protect themselves differently. As soon as that comes in, that again complicates the picture of how we think with climate change, how vector populations should change, and what the implications are for disease transmission. What it might give you is a kind of envelope. This is the potential. Does it actually pan out that way? You need to bring in this other information. Yeah?
It doesn't make sense to do like these long-term models, rather, short-term models, see what happens, and then do you think that would make sense?
Correct. So here, for example, so what they actually did is they kind of did 1960 to 1990, then they did 2011 to 2040, and then you're right. And then what's really nice is one of the few papers where they also show the uncertainty in their projections. And as you correctly pointed out, that uncertainty keeps increasing as you try to project way into the future. Yeah.
So can pathogen influence factors' life history traits?
Can
or
what, sorry?
Pathogen. If they can influence the factors' life history trait, or is there any evidence of complex interaction between climate change, pathogen, and factors, like climate change induced pathogen? I don't know.
Correct. So I won't go into it too much because I think you've done a lot with the pathogen, but just like the vector, the temperature range and the conditions under which the pathogen also does well varies. What pathogens do is they can affect host behavior, right? In terms of how, in ways that can affect transmission potential, in terms of how hosts move or interact with vectors and hosts. The reason it's also difficult, and which is why I'll just come to it, which is why some authors strongly believe we are not going to find climate change impacts, at least on mosquitoes, is because they think that at least with mosquitoes where you have human to human transmission, that how humans behave in terms of controlling the mosquito population and controlling their chances of being bitten, that completely messes up predictions. And they believe that maybe with tick systems where you have these non-human hosts, where there isn't as much, they're not just going to cull all deer in the US or something like that, there you might have more stable predictions than for these mosquito type human to human transmission systems. Sorry, I went away from your point, but I think basically I don't know too much about that. Maybe Farah, Uma, Guha would know more about the I think but I think she's thinking also of just climate change and pathogen.
How climate change can climate change induce change, how pathogen can influence factors life history trait due to some changes in climate, like climate change effect or something in that way, complex.
No, pathogen. Pathogen effects on vectors. So they might interact more. Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, these interact, but absolutely can. I think maybe Farah will be talking about it. I think you have found all kinds of interactions between ADs in an urban environment, right? Between the AD species in an urban environment. So yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yes. So where were we? Some of these models of how tick populations are likely, the projections for how tick populations are likely to change with climate change. And this was an example with dengue. So let's now talk about, so these are all these climate models, all of which, most of these models talk about these kinds of effects. Let me just quickly tell you that these kinds of models are largely models that you might have actually encountered in the past week. These what are called pattern modeling, where like ecological niche models, I think you had some of it yesterday, no? On niche models? No? Yeah? Okay, maybe. But the idea is very simple. The idea is you have data on where either you might, just use occurrence data. You have data on where ticks are now. You have data on different climatic variables or say host population densities where ticks are now. Based on that, you develop relationships. You see which of these different variables does temperature best predict current occurrence, or is it a combination of, it could be minimum temperature, maximum temperature, variation in temperature. Usually you throw one whole bunch of climatic variables to do with temperature, to do with precipitation, variability, means, max, min, etc. Maybe if you also have some like host population density, etc., you might put that in also, and you will get some kind of an equation that best predicts these current occurrences. Then what you do is you look at in the future, whenever whatever time period you're interested in, use good climate models to see now what's your new map of temperature, precipitation, or different variability in temperature, min, max, whatever you're interested in. So now you predict to this new environment. That's basically how these kind of pattern change models work. Does that make sense? The important thing is they are not mechanistic. And that's what we will come to just in a bit. That's what people are now really arguing for, saying you need to incorporate mechanism, meaning how do abiotic factors affect vectors? How do biotic factors affect vectors? How do vectors and hosts interact? How do pathogen host, pathogen vector, influence each other? What is the final outcome for disease transmission risk? And the reason that people are not happy completely, I mean, these are very useful, but the problem is what they are doing is they are taking, how whenever you did statistics, you were probably told if this is your regression and you fit your regression here, you were told, right, you cannot do this. Why can't you do that? Why were we told not to do that? Anybody? Can you think of why? Makes sense, right? Same line, just pull it one side or the other. Why shouldn't I do that?
Whatever the points that we have considered, it's only for certain, how do I put this? We cannot expect the pattern of the points to behave in a similar way as you expand the lines.
Yeah, absolutely, no, because this could have been the relationship.
Yes.
Or something like this.
That's what.
And I only captured this.
Only a part of it. So we cannot predict the behavior across.
Yeah. So whenever we try to predict to something new based on just the current patterns in numbers, we might run into a lot of risk. However, if we write out a mechanistic model saying more resources larvae will increase, but they will compete maybe, and you'll get smaller body size, lower flight, small body size, fewer eggs, local disease transmission, and you can actually check these links. So when you have a mechanistic model, it gives you, it's still not enough, because your mechanistic model, you don't know what's going to happen to the host. Say for the ticks, maybe as temperature, precipitation, everything increases, deer boom in numbers, because now their habitat is wonderful, right? That's now changed everything. So it's still not as, straightforward, but at least you can then figure out if you're going wrong, where, what else has changed in a way you've not expected, you can incorporate that. Which is why there is really this call for these mechanistic models. Okay, so yes, so we're back to these kind of ecological niche model kind of approaches. If we look, the reason for this, like I was telling, the reason people are not completely happy with this is because they don't capture the mechanisms, and the mechanisms matter. So for example, there was an analysis of, one of the papers I'll be sharing is an analysis of how something like increasing temperature will affect transmission potential in a mosquito vector. And the authors in the end couldn't decide. The reason being, increasing temperature was shortening generation lengths, so which means disease transmission potential goes up. But increasing temperature for the system they were modeling was also not good for the adult. So adults were dying sooner. So they had to say, okay, they are breeding faster but dying more and flying locally. How does that all integrate to affect disease transmission risk? And it was kind of ambiguous in the end, and they said somebody should do more work. So that was the conclusion. So we'll talk about way forward. Yes, yeah, because it's not satisfying to say nothing works. So we will end at way forward, right? Okay, so I must say there are a few cases where people have kind of done a bit of detective work and been able to say this is because of climate change. So I'll just show you a couple of those examples. So this is some work done in a part of Russia, I think, yeah, in eastern Russia on a tick population. And this is, this is where long-term data is beautiful. So one of the things we'll end with, where we talk about what is needed, is we really need to invest in long-term surveillance monitoring, which Farah also will be talking about. So what they found, these are basically, where is this? Yes. This is basically how tick populations have increased in 2 sites over time, and they were trying to figure out what else has changed over these 2 sites. One is, forget about exactly what this degree days means, except that it's an index of warming. So basically what they found is that warming was the best predictor for tick increase, and usually the controversy is because most critics point out over time temperature is increasing, right, precipitation is changing, so many other things are changing, human numbers are changing, mammal host populations are changing, etc. Here they actually did that. They actually also had long-term data on small mammals, and they found that it just fluctuated all over the place. On larger mammals, which also didn't go in the way they predicted to explain tick population. So here they actually tried to link climate change through long-term data with tick populations, because that's in the end what you need. You need to show that with the change in whatever driver you're imagining, your vector population changes, or the disease you're interested in changes accordingly, and that's just so difficult. So one example I'll give where people kind of tried to dissect it and found the opposite effect was again with ticks, but this was in the US. where Lyme disease has been increasing in certain areas in the US. So you know Lyme disease, right? Tick-borne disease, bacterial, yeah. Okay. What they found is that even though things about the climate are changing, what they were able to link it more closely was a recovery. Hunting had been prohibited in certain parts or brought under control in certain parts. The white-tailed deer populations increased. Along with that, small mammal populations also increased. And small mammals are the ones. So deer are incompetent kind of hosts. The pathogen doesn't actually multiply long enough, stay in there for like really facilitating infection. It's the small mammal to deer to human host that really works. Small mammal numbers had also increased for a different reason. Deer increased because hunting was controlled. Small mammal numbers increased because coyotes had come back in that area. Coyotes decreased foxes, which ate these small mammals. So they were able to map out this ecological interaction, which ultimately could explain Lyme disease patterns better than climate change. So I think what I want to, I think we should end now. What I want to end with is to say, I don't want to end on this note that, oh, it's very difficult, it depends, I should know the maximum about every system and every place. That's not satisfying at all. We want some generalities, right? One generality that people are pointing to, like I said, is a mechanistic model approach. So for example, one of the papers I'll share with you talks about how can we take a trait-based approach. So let's look at something very important like biting rates in mosquitoes. Let's look at how that changes between infected and not infected females. Let's look at how that changes over time, the lifetime of the females. Let's look at how it changes with temperature, put it all together, and then combine it with, in a model where you have population dynamics of the vector, you also have species interactions, and you have transmission dynamics, and they try and demo it to say that yes, something like this can work. The more complex it gets, more daunting. So the trick is to find key features that are important in a particular system and try and build mechanistic models with those key features in there. Because if you want to make everything very specific to one situation, like ICTS, what predicts whether you're going to be bitten by Aedes here or not, you probably can't take that to even IISc maybe, I don't know. So you don't want to make it too specific either, you want that. There are other broader generalities people talk about, which is based on, like I was telling, life history traits. So there are some interesting papers which talk about how you can make certain generalizations because of differences between ticks and tick-borne diseases versus mosquitoes and mosquito-borne diseases. So again here the predictive capability comes from thinking about their evolutionary ecology and what that implies for climate interactions, host interactions, and prediction. So generalities are possible. So possible by considering the biology of the vectors and kind of extracting out, stepping back and extracting out generalities about the biology. So longer generation lengths, shorter generation lengths, which means current weather will affect, this is more long-term climate rather than current weather. So you can make generalities like that. You can then also make mechanistic models that, again, where you have to think of key features of your vector, host, and pathogen system, and then see if you can even test it, because it's not like climate change is happening now, right? It's been happening, and there are places where there has been some monitoring. Can we use that data? And some of these, short generation lengths, you can even use very kind of, past 5 years, data like that also, to try and set up some of these models. So coming up with predictive frameworks is possible if we, pay sufficient attention to the biology there. So I think I'll stop there. But I don't know, Uma, if that sufficiently addressed your, is it all a
Thanks,
mess?
Kavita. No, it did. But I think the way that science also is, or the way research is, it tends to be kind of focused on, like, everybody wants some big picture things, some quick insights. Yet many of the problems we're dealing with actually require more, hunker in and, boots on the ground kind of thing. So that is a problem we all face. And I'm sure you all will think about it. How can you go forward in your careers? What can you do with, the diverse things you've seen? But this is really important. But also because they're so difficult to study, right? Vectors are difficult to study. So maybe if you can just take one more minute to say, like the approach you have taken of lab-based approaches, how does that fit in with something like this? Because that's something they've not heard at all about.
Right. Yeah, so I think as I was telling you before, some of the work that we've been doing is trying to understand very broadly speaking, the behavioral and evolutionary ecology of largely Aedes species. So the traits we've been focusing on, some are female reproductive traits. So trying to understand oviposition strategies in mosquitoes. And that was stimulated because, in a kind of rural setting, among these different containers, both artificial containers in nursery areas and in these rock pools, you'd find some with huge numbers of larvae and some with very few. So it was very puzzling, why, and people were getting bitten there. So there were lots of mosquitoes around also. So why some pools have lots of them, some pools very few. So we were trying to understand these oviposition strategies, and we combined it both with, because the problem is, you need to know, to say that mosquitoes do best if they lay their eggs here, that means you have to say that they survive best, they lay the more eggs. You need to measure fitness. How do you do that? Very difficult in the field with mosquitoes. So in the lab, you can actually break it down also. That when mosquitoes, for example, the females we found actually like to lay eggs where there are a few predators. So they have evolved so that they actually pay attention to where predators are. They also like to lay eggs where there are a few competitors. So they prefer intermediate larval and egg densities even. So again, the idea here is to use the lab to understand how fitness works, how different traits affect fitness, and then use that to try and understand behavior in wild mosquitoes. And most of our work has been more with rural mosquitoes, where you see, desiccation risk, predation, competition, all working together. Now, what recently we've been doing is trying to also build some of these agent-based models where we want to ask, okay, if you have a particular landscape, you can think of a rural landscape or an urban landscape, and so you have these kinds of larval habitats, this distribution of a host, and now density goes down. Like suppose you have a vector control strategy come in here and you come and fumigate adults, you don't get rid of all of them, right? If densities go down, can we use density dependent responses in the lab to say what will happen? Will you actually get rid of mosquitoes, or will you have mosquitoes that fly more and actually do something very different with the disease in the environment? So that's something we've just started because we just needed a lot of information on these ecological and behavioral parameters first.
Thank you so much, Kavita.
Fitness. In evolutionary terms, what we understand by fitness is kind of long-term spread of alleles in a population, right? But how, as a behavioral ecologist, how you usually study it is you have proxies. So for example, lifetime production of offspring, or if you can go one step further, production of grand offspring, which is like a proxy for how well, if you have more grand offspring than individual doing a different thing, a different trait variant, then this is more likely to kind of spread in the population than that. You can have closer and closer proxies. People use survival as a proxy, fecundity, number of eggs laid as a proxy. Some people even use body condition as a proxy. The understanding being, if you're in better body condition, you might have many more offspring, which will then go on to multiply. That's